Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. for the Institute for Dialectical Metarealism. Let's get rolling. I'm going to be returning to a subject I addressed a few months ago, and that is on the importance of spirituality in Maoism Third Worldism. First, a quick refresher. In much of the Third World, certainly not all of it, any kind of overarching statement, which would cover an entire portion of the world, would at the very least be misguided, misinformed, and honestly disrespectful to people living in different parts of the world. But certainly, in many parts of the Third World, especially parts of the Third World that are also Fourth World, say, for example, parts of Latin America, parts of Africa, parts of the South Pacific, parts of the Caribbean. There is a very close association between life and spirituality. In the first world, and I'm saying this as a sociologist of religion, we tend to make a very harsh difference between religion and spirituality on the one hand and the rest of life on the other. So, for example, we relegate spirituality to one day a week. Is that universal in the first world? Of course not, but it is common. Typically Friday, Saturday, or Sunday. That is the day for spirituality, the day when everything else is forgotten and people go to a house of worship, people celebrate, people turn to a higher being or beings, people turn within and experience the spiritual dimension of their lives. Not so in much of the third and especially the fourth world, where spirituality is very closely intermixed with the rest of life. So it is very difficult, for example, to distinguish religion from family, religion from government, religion from the economy, religion from education. Religion or spirituality is a part of everything. Everything one does, everything one is, everything one works for is in some way intermixed with a spiritual component. I found that myself when I went to Central Africa, and I noticed how everything that many of the people I met did had a spiritual component. Everything, without exception. Was that universally true? No. But it was true a whole heck of a lot of time. I was really, really impressed. I was taken aback. And I realized that these people have something that I am missing, and most likely something that I will never gain. They are in a very different condition. They are socialized into a world where spirituality and religion is a part of everything. Now, Did it used to be like that in what we now call the first world? Yes. But we lost it. We lost it. How? Two major reasons. One, industrialization, the Industrial Revolution, and urbanization, which are very closely intermixed. As industry starts, as factories are built in cities, those factories need people to leave their farms and move into the cities to become workers. That is how capitalism developed, by attracting people into the cities. And it wasn't hard. Most young people, if given a choice between living in a very remote part of the world and living in a metropolis, would choose the metropolis. I would too. I would not want to live out in the middle of nowhere. And I say that as somebody who has. I was not happy living in the Appalachian Mountains of Virginia. I was bored out of my mind. Being a native of New York City, it simply didn't suit me. I was literally like a fish out of water. I did not belong where I was. I knew that. And the people that I knew when I was there knew that about me too. And they knew I was not going to be there very long. And that was right. So with industrialization comes urbanization. With urbanization comes the end of the extended family. Extended families are very appropriate for farms. More people to do the chores. The more people you have, the better your farm is, the more efficient your farm can become. But when you are living in a city, a large extended family is counterproductive. You don't need it. It is ineffective. The smaller the family that you have, the better it is, which is actually one of the reasons why birth control, which began in the 19th century as well in its modern form. I mean, there were types of birth control before that, as far back as the Roman Empire. But in the modern world, it began in the 19th century. It was very attractive because suddenly there was a way to maintain a romantic life with one's partner, but at the same time, not have to worry or worry so much about having a large family. A large family was not necessary. You don't need people to do the chores. You need a small family, one person to stay home. Since the 19th century, that person has generally been the woman. That is gradually changing, but still, it is generally the woman. The man who goes out and works. Of course, increasingly, women and men are both working outside the family. In some places, women actually work outside the family more than men. And so women are doing double work. They are working outside the home, and they are coming home and being mothers and housekeepers. It is not a very effective way of running a household, but that's the world that we have created, at least for now. So, what happens in a situation like this is that religion becomes less and less important. Religion, which was important on the farm, in a small community of like-minded people who all believed in the same thing, went to the same house of worship and spent their time studying the Bible or whatever religious scripture they followed. But now, in a city, they are suddenly surrounded by people of all different types, people of different religions. And so you have a process that we call in sociology secularization. The secularization process, or what can also be called desacralization, meaning the sacred becomes less and less important. Emil Durkheim, famous sociologist, said that there were two basic aspects of life. One is the sacred, and the other is the profane. In a primitive agricultural society, everything is sacred. Everything. Or at least it has a sacred dimension to it. But in a modern industrialized society, that is no longer the case. Suddenly, the sacred is relegated to a certain day of the week, as I said, if it is relegated to a day of the week at all. Sometimes the sacred is simply abandoned, as it was in my family of orientation, or my family of origin, my parents' family, in other words. We had no real religious or spiritual dimension to our family life. We were a secular Jewish family who generally had bacon and eggs in the morning. And if you know anything about Jewish kosher laws, you will know that that is not something that Jews are supposed to do. Bacon is a pork product. But did my parents care? No. That became irrelevant because it is a different type of living arrangement where religion, if it exists at all, takes a back seat. And that is the world that we live in here in most of the first world, and also in a large part of the third world as well. But when you go to many fourth world places, especially in the third world, but also to an extent here where I am in the first world, you find a great deal of emphasis on spirituality, great deal of emphasis upon finding the truth that underlies the reality of existence. Worship is very, very important. Whatever kind of worship it is, in fourth world or indigenous societies. That is not so where I am. And it has not been so any place I have lived during my lifetime. I have been exposed to it by visiting tribal reservations here in the US, by visiting tribal reserves in Canada. But when I go there, I am an outsider. I know I do not belong there. I am a visitor. I am not a part of their community. But if you are a part of that community, you are a part of a spiritual community, a truly spiritual community, something that generally we have lost here in most of the first world, and as I said, in much of the industrialized third world as well, especially the more urbanized areas of the third world, like, for example, Mexico City. And so it's very, very different when you go into a fourth world area. And so that is the thing that I want to focus on, primarily the fourth world, and especially the fourth world in the third world. Because do we have a fourth world here in the first world? Yes. But the problem is that it is so contaminated in many cases, not always, by the first world that it is simply not quite the same thing. But in many parts of the fourth world, although sadly a decreasing number of them because of things like deforestation, which has done tremendous harm to many of the Amazon rainforests and have taken people that 20 years ago lived a very simple life with no contact with the outside world. Now they have TVs and computers. Their lives have been turned upside down. But there are still some places, still some fourth world places, which do have that element of spirituality. And so, Roy Bhaskar, the founder of critical realism, as I call it, Bhaskarian critical realism, I use that qualifier, that adjective, because there are different critical realisms besides the one that Roy Bhaskar developed. I have often said that I wish that critical realism were called something else, because it is very confusing using a term that is used by more than 24 other unrelated philosophies, which is why I'm forced to have to qualify critical realism as Bhaskarian critical realism. But I'm willing to do that to make myself clear. One of the turns or stages of Roy Bhaskar's critical realism, he called transcendental dialectical critical realism. He developed it around the year 2000. This was after he took an extended trip to India. India was the homeland of his father. His mother was English. He had never been to India before. It was a new experience for him. When he was there, he met with many different Hindu gurus. I think that the greatest inspiration that he had, and this is only my speculation, but I think it's true based upon what I've read, came from Aurobindo, the great Indian guru Aurobindo, because there is considerable influence that I see of Aurobindo's ideas in the work of Roy Bhaskar and his critical realism, and especially the expansion of critical realism into the philosophy of meta-reality, which he developed in the aughts, the early 2000s. What he said in transcendental dialectical critical realism is that each one of us should find some kind of spiritual path. Roy Bhaskar found a few of them, but the major one was Maharishi Mahesh Yogi's transcendental meditation. He practiced it diligently, at least for a while. It became a very uplifting force in his life. I don't know this, but I think that he got the term transcendental dialectical critical realism from transcendental meditation. That would seem like a reasonable assumption to me, although I can't prove it. Roy felt that it didn't matter what the spiritual path was, but some spiritual path was good. And by following that path, we could embark on a road to our own spiritual transformations, both as individuals and as communities. To Roy, transformation begins with the individual, discovering the spiritual, discovering what we in the first world have largely lost. Spirituality, transcendence, incorporating that into our lives, finding some way to make spirituality important to us. I know people, one person in particular, who at one time was following a couple of different spiritual paths. She later abandoned them. And what I've noticed, and obviously I will not say what her name is that her life has taken a downward turn since that time. Now, I personally did not particularly like the spiritual paths that she was pursuing, but at least it was something. Now she has nothing. And she seems to me to be a relatively unhappy person. I really wish that she would rediscover something like that again. I have often considered mentioning that to her, but I don't know how to do it in a diplomatic way, and so I haven't. Maybe at some point I will. If it comes up in a conversation, I will suggest it. But my feeling is that even if I suggest it, that the chances of her paying attention to me are not very good. That's just my suspicion. I could be wrong, but that's my suspicion. A lot of people need that. What I've noticed, maybe you have too, the last year, maybe 2 years, here in the Western world, or here where I am in the United States, more specifically, Mission, Texas, the Rio Grande Valley of Texas, 2 miles north of Mexico. Most people I meet here on the U.S. side of the Mexican-U.S. border are very unhappy, are going through tremendous trauma, tremendous suffering. Whether that is true on the Mexican side, I don't know. I'm not going to make any kinds of spectacular claims for Mexico and say, well, of course, Mexico is better, because I don't know that. I know there is corruption in Mexico too. I've met people from Mexico when they've come over here, and they are not very happy there too, because they deal with the drug cartels, and they are constantly under threat of having their homes taken away from them, or their cars, or even of being killed. That it cannot be a very pleasant way of life. I do not have to worry about that. And so in that sense, I guess my life is somewhat better. And yet, even myself, despite that, despite my undeserved financial affluence, really undeserved. Undeserved is an understatement. I got it purely by accident. Purely by accident. And it is all in the hands of my fiduciary. I live like a working class man. No money here. I don't want it. Maybe sometime I will need it, but I don't want it. I don't want that money. I think that money might contaminate me, might contaminate my heart. I simply don't want that money anywhere around me if I can avoid it. I know it's there. I know it's in 3 bank accounts that are managed by my fiduciary, but good, let her manage them so I can keep my hands off of that stuff. I genuinely do not want it. So I used to think, in fact, I would tell my students that contrary to popular opinion, money can buy happiness. That's based on sociological research. A lot of research has found that wealthy people are happier than poor people. And I can understand why that would be. You have fewer concerns, fewer worries. You don't have to think about your food, your medical care, your housing. But when I look at myself, and it's only myself, am I happier now since I discovered my wealth, that I am a multimillionaire now, than I was before I knew it? No. I am actually more unhappy. I am actually more unhappy. I don't want it. On that level, I'm unhappy. So what I have done is I have thrown myself into that kind of transformation program that Roy Bhaskar mentions in his transcendental dialectical critical realism. And I am trying to make myself into a person who is happy for entirely different reasons. Now, I will tell you what Roy did. After he developed transcendental dialectical critical realism, he came up with a new turn in critical realism that he called the philosophy of meta-reality. There is a lot of similarity between transcendental dialectical critical realism and the philosophy of meta-reality, but there are also differences. Transcendental dialectical critical realism is epistemic or epistemological. It is based upon how we can know things, especially how we can know spiritual things. The philosophy of meta-reality, on the other hand, is primarily ontological. Namely, it is about our beings. Who am I? And how can I, as a being, be transformed? That's the philosophy of meta-reality. I love it. But when Roy developed the philosophy of meta-reality, he watered down his recommendation that everyone needs to have a spiritual path, a path of transformation. And he said that any type of activity, any kind of activity, which works for the emancipation of others is good. Now, I think that's fine, but I think they both need to go together. I don't think you can have one without the other, or let me rephrase that. Without being judgmental, I don't think that you should have one without the other. Yes, it is good to work for the emancipation of others, but yes, it is also good to have a spiritual transformation program, which is what I have been working on and developing in my life. It's actually the same program that I embraced when I was 14 years old, but it's become more intensified in recent years. It relates primarily to my religion, the Baha'i faith, but my own particular take on that religion, which is, I assume, relatively unique to me. I don't know many other people who would share most of my views, and I am fine with that. I present my views when I go to Baha'i meetings. Many times people say that, gee, I've never heard that before, or I've never thought about it that way before. And I hope that means that I am on the right track. Obviously, I have no way of knowing that, but I hope it does. When I say on the right track, I mean two things. On the right track to my own transformation, and on the right track to helping to emancipate others. So I have coupled transformational dialectical critical realism with the philosophy of meta-reality. In my view, they belong together. They should not be separated from one another. You need the epistemological aspect, the knowledge aspect, and you need the ontological aspect, the being aspect. One of them alone is simply insufficient, at least as I see it. That's my own personal view. You can disagree with me if you like, obviously. So that is what I have tried to do, and I hope I've been clear. When I look at the fourth world, I see something I want, but that I don't have and I never will have, because I am not living in the fourth world. I am not indigenous to the United States. In fact, I don't really know where I am indigenous to, if any place. Maybe Greater West Asia, but that's going back thousands of years. So right now, I'm not indigenous anywhere. I have no place of indigeneity. Does that bother me? It does sometimes, yes, but I live with it. It's not the worst thing in the world, and I'm surrounded by people who are in the same situation that I am in. So I am not alone. By the same token, because of my dedication to critical realism, both transformational, dialectical critical realism, and the philosophy of meta-reality, and my dedication to my religion, the Baha'i faith, I think that I have found a way, possibly, to liberate myself, to transform my own life, and also, hopefully, to emancipate, to facilitate the transformations of others as well. For the time being, this has been Mark, by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.